gull control over to mouse control now. Really in-depth talk by Dr. Mike Ayers from Precision Pest Management. Again, we'll do sort of half an hour, 35 minutes presentation with Mike, and then we'll do some questions. So thank you, Mike. I'll leave it over to you.
Thank you, Natalie. Good morning, everyone. Right, so let me find the way of starting the share of my screen. We're talking about mouse control. We're really specifically talking about internal mouse control. And outside mice are basically just owl food and really, I think, off limits. So we're really talking about inside. And for those of you who can't see the mouse in this picture, there it is there. I don't know, can you see my pointer?
We
Nothing?
can, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, great. Okay, great. Well, there you are. There's the mouse hiding there, which I thought was a good photo. So why is good mouse control really important to us? Well, it's actually important to us for a variety of reasons. The first one, clearly, resistance. Mice, well, both rats and mice are increasingly becoming resistant to our anticoagulants or the products we're allowed to use. That's clearly going to be a problem. Increasing legislation. If we don't get it right and we end up poisoning wildlife or poisoning non-target animals or children or contaminating products and food, then clearly the legislators are going to come down on us hard and have done and made our life increasingly difficult. Although actually it's all been with good intent because it's about protecting the environment. In parallel with this, you've got a biocides directive where you've got this pressure from Europe or pressure from environmental bodies in reducing the active ingredients that we've got to actually do the job. And we're limited basically at the moment, as far as I can see, to two products, an anticoagulant and alpha chlorelose. There may be another one on the market, I'm told, but it doesn't appear to have arrived at the moment. Somebody can correct me later, perhaps, but we've got very little left in our armory. And good mouse control, of course, for better public health, for our customers, making sure that they don't suffer mice for longer than necessary. Resistance is more than just metabolic or physiological, it's also behavioral. And we've all suffered we all have to work to now the CREW guidelines. And here's just a classic example of what we've found in terms of a sort of behavioral resistance, where you've got some tracking dust here, and you've got clear evidence of this mouse just running around it, not just once, but several times. This clearly isn't good for us as an industry in terms of being able to control mice. So, some basics to remember. Firstly, you can't keep mice out of 99.9% of buildings. I've added that 99.9% because there will be some buildings which are so well proofed and so well managed that mice will find it greatly difficult to get in there. However, they may not be able to walk in, but they can certainly be carried in, and that's where you can never guarantee that a building that's never been or never had a mouse for 20 years couldn't get one tomorrow. It might be unlikely, but it's not impossible. You can't guarantee that it will always be food free. If you've got people in there, people bring food in there. So there'll always be something. If people don't bring food in there, then there are also things that fly in. A dead insect is pretty good as far as a mouse is concerned. It's equivalent of a hula hoop, dare I mention a brand. It's a small salty crisp, a snack, and you get lots of dead insects ending up in roof spaces and roof voids. And one of the signs that you often get when you've got a mouse infestation in a roof space is you end up with lots of pairs of wings because the mice have eaten the bodies. You can't kill mice with mouse biscuits, also known as non-tox. And to kill mice, you've got to use something lethal. Remember, this is the basics here. You've got to use something lethal if you've got to kill mice. Prevention is always better than having to kill them, but eventually you will have to kill mice at some point. Electronic or ultrasonic deterrents just don't work. Some ultrasonic deterrents might have a very short-term effect, but certainly when I was involved in, and still am involved in mouse control, where I've seen these used, and this was particularly on farms, the farmers used to call them the mouse discos because they just danced around them. And follow-ups are essential. And this follow-ups, if you don't follow up properly, you leave survivors. Survivors will be the ones that have shown the most adaptable behavior, or the least tolerance, or shall we say the most tolerance to the anticoagulant, and therefore perhaps the start of resistance. So, unfortunately, our industry has been engaged in a couple of massive but very crude experiments through poor technique. And we said, let's see what we can do to create populations of mice that can actually eat the toxic bait and survive. Let's see if we can create populations of mice that actually don't like going inside our boxes and will avoid our traps and glue boards. And I'm sure you've all come across these. I certainly have. And let's see if we can create a population of mice that don't like eating Bitrex. This one's perhaps a little more contentious. And actually, there at the moment, there doesn't seem to be any evidence that mice are avoiding Bitrex. My personal experience is that when a particular product moved from a non-Bitrex product to one with Bitrex in it, its palatability seemed to go down. And there's good evidence that some elements of mouse populations can taste Bitrex. Whether they ignore it or not is another matter. And we know that product with Bitrex in it still works very well. But mice are incredibly adaptable. And if you've got a small part of the population that don't like eating it, it's possible that we may have another problem in the making. But at the moment, it's not there. I said that mice are very adaptable. The anticoagulant coumarin-based baits were first developed in the early 1950s, but even before the end of the decade, there was detectable resistance in both rat and mouse populations. And the same thing has occurred with the second generation anticoagulants when they were developed in the 70s. Only this time, the resistance was first spotted even more quickly. And we've got something that's equally worrying, possibly more worrying, is that you've got behavioral resistance in mice, which first turned up in Birmingham in the bull ring, and we certainly find it evident in most major conurbations around England. Probably much less so in Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland, but very evident in England. And currently dealing with a population of mice in London, which appear to want to walk around everything. So this is an increasing problem. So I think it's important to go back to basics, because if we've simply relied on the box to do the job, we've missed a trick, and we've missed the whole point of good mouse control, predicated on the basis of integrated pest management, IPM, something that you've all heard. The integrated bit means thinking about the entire environment rather than just how can I kill it. So what do mice need? They clearly need the same as us: food, shelter, breeding sites, water and warmth. I put a question on water because, of course, we all know that mice don't need dietary water. Whilst if it's available, they may well take it. But if the food content has got a moisture content of 15, 16% or above, then they don't need to actually drink water. And you may not have thought about this. Why 15 or 16%? If you go back to the where mice have come from, the origin of the mouse, which is out in the field, in meadows and woodlands, things like that. What have mice got to eat out there? Well, they're eating grass seeds, nuts, dried fruits, things like that. But what happens in summer? when you've got a long, dry summer where it hasn't rained for a month. A mouse living in the center of a meadow doesn't have direct access to water, unless there's perhaps a bit of dew in the morning. But he may be 200 meters away from the nearest stream, or even a mile away from the nearest stream. How is he going to survive then without water? When you look at the natural moisture content of grains and seeds, even in summer, it's around about 14, 15, 16%. And in fact, it's at 15% that farmers will harvest their grain because it preserves better at that level. But around about 15% is the natural moisture content of seeds and grains out in the wild, and mice have adapted to being able to live on food material that's got as little as 15% moisture content. So a bit of biology there. So why is it important that we get back to basics, and why we understand how mice develop within a property or a building, and how we've got to control it using all environmental controls? And this is important because the very fact that we've got such widespread resistance means that we aren't applying the basic principles. And we're allowing mice to survive. And by allowing mice to survive, we're actually selecting for the strongest, most resistant to the chemicals we're using, and most resistant to the techniques we use to deliver the chemicals, or the ways that we're trying to kill them. And in reality, what I'm saying is that the industrial pest mouse is really the creation of the industrial pest controller. It may sound contentious, but I believe there's a great deal of truth in that. So, to manage pests to extinction, you've got to manage the environment. You've got to manage the whole building, both inside and out, and the people and the processes that they operate. It isn't just about bait or trapping boxes. Basically, we've got to remove the food, the shelter, and all the water, and the warmth, if at all possible. They don't survive well in deep freezes, although they can do if they can live outside the deep freeze and forage inside. They end up being very furry, but again, remember, they're very adaptable. But having removed or managed the environment, if you've got mice left, you've got to kill them as quickly as possible. And proper mouse control is not about just box checking. We do have to put boxes down because they're a good monitoring tool, but it's not just about box checking. And you've literally got to think outside the box, outside the bait box, perhaps is a better way of putting it. And if as a pest controller you aren't behaving as a skilled and knowledgeable expert to your clients, then you do run the risk of becoming just another box checker, which frankly, from when I was doing it, was pretty boring. And I always find doing it from a very much more holistic point of view was very much more satisfactory and actually very much more effective. So how about this? True or false? Well, when I'm doing my teaching, I put this up and I get a lot of sort of ums and ahs and nodding of heads, but essentially it's true. And this is because buildings might be badly designed. They're designed by people, which let mice in. They're badly maintained, poorly cleaned, poorly monitored, and poorly managed. All of these can allow either mice to get in or mice to thrive. And if it's poorly managed by the pest controller, then we're also letting them get away with it. Each is creating the right condition for mice to thrive. And therefore, each needs to be addressed, even down to starting with the architects and convincing them not to build it with great big air vents that will be big enough to let mice in. So when I was a new and fresh pest controller many years ago, this is what I was taught about the basic principles. Not only about ERD, exclusion, restriction, destruction, it's all fairly self-evident, and many of you, I hope, would have seen this and understood it. But ERDM is not just the basic principle of basic principles of pest control. It's a way about thinking about how you deliver your pest control, how you do your inspections, by checking the perimeters. Is there any way for a rodent to get in here? Are there gaps under the doors, broken air bricks, holes in the wall because engineers have put a pipe in and not sealed it up? When you go inside, is it clean and tidy? Is it clean and tidy outside? Are we drawing mice to the building who are then running around and finding their way in through that open door? Exclusion and restriction are really client-based activities, and that's their responsibility to manage those. Ours is to help them manage it by pointing it out. Killing it, the destruction bit, really should be the last resort. That's because everything else has failed up to that point. And it has failed essentially because of people. Someone hasn't done their job properly. And it's up to us to go away and go and kill them. Having killed them, we've got to then monitor it and keep an eye on it. This isn't always a sequential set of operations. Sometimes when presented with an infestation at a new site for yourselves, you've got to do all of it in parallel and sometimes all of it at the same time. Although sometimes not everything can be done all at once. But for the protection of public health, very often the destruction element, having to kill them, has to start straight away. So I have what here I call the triangle of death, starts with ERD, which we've just covered. WATN, where are they now? So when presented with an infestation, what I do is I will go into the building, whether it's a warehouse or a shop or a food factory, and say, well, where are they now? Where's this little blighter living now? Where's it going to bed? Because that's what you've got to do. And that's the point of good inspection. And that's where you use your monitoring devices to identify the extent of the infestation. Because once you've asked that question, where are they now? Then you know what you're going to be able to do about it. And one of the things you're going to do about it is always, always, always take the rodenticide to the mouse. Which is why it's so important to identify, to ask that question, where are they now? Because if you can't answer that question, it becomes very much more difficult to control the infestation. You're just relying on mice finding your bait boxes, which might be just around wall floor junctions or on wall tops. But you've got to find where they are. Once you've found that, that's where you take the bait. Get it as close to where they're living as possible. If you can get it into their harborages, even better. Because that way, they may not come out. Just one example of where we were faced with a new client who'd had a mouse infestation that had been running around there for years. And no one had ever been able to get on top of it. And I must admit, this has actually only happened to me once, but we identified where they were coming from, and they were all wall cavity based. So we baited the cavities. And for the day we baited all the cavities, which we baited really very, very thoroughly, cavities low and high, and ceiling voids as well. The moment we baited those, they stopped seeing mice. Really very unusual, but no one saw a mouse after that for a long time. We knew they were there. We knew they were dying because of the smell and the number of blowflies. But no mice came out of the cavities because we provided them with what they needed, which was food. They'd already got the harborage, and food was the bait, which in this particular case was particularly effective. So always take the rodenticide to the mouse. The greatest failures to control mice stem from three main issues on the pest controller's side. And that's accepting that the clients don't always do their job. They often make your job very much more difficult. But failure to bait the harborages, failure to use enough rodenticide, and a failure to follow up properly. Using enough rodenticide in the right place and following it up regularly, sometimes daily if you feel you need to, but normally every 3, 4, 5 days should be sufficient. As long as every time you do a follow-up, you reassess what needs doing and you refine and review your techniques, and just get them better and better and better each time, and the numbers will just drop. But you need to follow up until you've got no further evidence. And the old M&S used to be follow up for 48 hours times 3 plus 7 days, which is about 2 weeks. Excuse me. But in reality, research has shown that actually follow-ups need to be conducted over a little longer period, perhaps 3 weeks, to really make sure you've got the tail enders. So these 3 failures eventually end up with survivors and the development of resistance either to the active ingredients or the techniques. Mice are really adaptable. And what you've got to remember is that mice, our generation time is around about sort of 20 to 30 years. A mouse's generation time is around about 8 weeks. If they're going at their fastest, perhaps 8 to 10 weeks. But that basically means you can have 5 or 6 generations in a year, which means that they have a remarkable ability to become adapted to the new circumstances that they face, whether that's chemical threats or behavioral threats. So for us as professional pest controllers, a lot of it starts with monitoring. And how we do this makes the difference between stopping a mouse just after it's got in or leaving it undetected long enough to do damage or breed. There are lots of monitoring techniques around out there and lots of monitoring devices. But effective monitoring reduces callouts, reduces the risk of resistance, reduces food safety issues, and certainly will improve customer satisfaction if we can prevent an infestation or kill the mouse at the one stage rather than wait till there's 21. Now, monitoring can be preemptive or reactive. If you are going to make that difference, it really needs to be preemptive, because reactive is always a little bit too late. So, various techniques. You've got toxic baits, you've got traps, but you definitely don't have glue boards. So please, no glue boards for routine monitoring. We need to be using our glue boards. I put a plug in here just to be using them as sparingly as possible and only when absolutely necessary. There is pressure from, the interested parties to ban glue boards, and there's already a proposal in Scotland to ban them completely up in Scotland, which might be just the thin end of the wedge. So we need to be using our glue boards carefully and properly. Reactive monitoring, well, non-toxic bait. Non-toxic bait, yes, it's bait. Yes, it'll tell us a mouse has been there, but all it's actually doing is feeding it. You're waiting till the mouse has come in, you've fed it some food, and then you've got to come back and find out, has it eaten the food or not? Yeah, that's fine, but it might take 6 weeks for you to get back to that. Nibble blocks, whilst they don't feed them, can be useful, but again, they require high frequency inspection so that you're as close to the incident as possible, rather than waiting 5 or 6 weeks before you come back. Electronic systems have that immediacy, and good electronic system can be really very good at picking up early signs of mice and allowing you to react very much more quickly. And that's the great advantage of electronic systems. But they do come with a price, and not everyone wants to use them or can afford to use them. Tracking products can be really useful for monitoring, but again, like non-toxic bait and nibble blocks, they require high frequency of inspection, because you don't want to leave it down too long with a nice set of mouse footprints, only to discover 6 weeks later that they were made at that time, and it's now not one mouse but 12. So which one do you choose? And this is really going to depend upon the situation. The public health risk will probably come first and be the greatest driver of what you use, the E. coli here with the food poisoning and the damage to electrical systems, with the risks to people, products, and property. So your monitoring system has got to be up to the task. How quickly do you want to know that you've got mice? Do you want to know as soon as possible? Or here's your multiple choice test. 3 weeks, 3 months, 6 weeks, 7 days, as soon as possible. Well, that's really a bit of a daft question, because actually, if you've got mice, you really want to know as soon as possible. So your system needs to be targeted at the risks that the mice present. If the mice present a high risk, your system has got to be up to the task and make sure you pick them up quickly. For me, non-toxic bait monitoring does have its place, but really only as a short-term part of a wider program to determine the extent of an infestation, unless you can inspect it very frequently. Again, putting mouse biscuits down yet can be a really good monitor, but no good if you then ignore it for 6 weeks. So it needs checking, whether that's yourself or whether it's the customer. That really is down to how you organize yourself, because there's no toxic element to it. So the customer can check it should you want them to do so. Electronic monitoring, much more useful, very instant, but more expensive. Otherwise, for routine monitoring, my experience is that a lethal system, like a toxic bait, if it's appropriate, or a suitable trapping box, is much more likely to prevent an infestation. If it's not safe to use either toxic bait or a trapping box, then use an electronic system or a very high-frequency non-toxic monitoring system. Now, I've suggested toxic bait might be a useful preemptive method for monitoring. And shock horror, is that still allowed? Well, actually, yes, it is, if you take the proper precautions. And that's very important. And that's where your training, that's where your, that's the purpose of examinations. That's the purpose of making sure that you're certified, so that you have the right training so you can make the right decisions. So just some basic facts. The food hygiene regulations, all reasonable precautions must be exercised, are exercised, all due diligence to avoid the commission of an offence. Okay, let me read that. So I didn't read that terribly clearly. Basically, the building owner or the business owner or the householder, well, if it's commercial property, they have to take every practical precaution to prevent an offence from being occurring. Is non-tox preventative? Not really. It's only when inspected very frequently, because it clearly cannot be acceptable to allow a rodent to run around a food facility unhindered for several weeks. Some other facts, crew. And crew is an important part of our life now. But even Alan Buckle has recognized that there is a place for permanent baiting, particularly indoors, but only after all the other alternatives have been considered. Okay, so we are only talking about permanent baiting indoors. Is there a difference between permanent baiting indoors and outside? Yes, there are lots of important differences. But the important one is where the balance between the risks and benefits of indoor baiting for the control of persistent mouse infestations is weighted significantly towards this technique. Because clearly indoors, the risks to wildlife are going to be very much less. And really the governing factor, whether you use toxic bait indoors for permanent baiting, is going to be, is there a high potential for reinvasion? And this is an extract from the crew guidelines. Is there a high potential reinvasion? And are other methods of control insufficient? Now, other methods of control might be non-toxic monitoring, but with high frequency. That could be appropriate. The use of trapping boxes. We find them really very useful at hoovering up the invader mouse and stopping it from becoming 21. And it's really down to you to make that judgment and do that assessment of, is this a site that has a high potential for reinvasion? And I would say that that there are sites that you can. But first of all, please let me encourage you to read the crew guidelines. They will help you to understand what you can and cannot do. So, where you're expected to exercise your skill and judgment, and to decide on the risks, that the risks of the site are high enough. And the locations where this would be true, I would guess, would be, say, all food premises, where it's stored, where it's manufactured, or where it's sold. The Food Safety Act comes in here very strongly. Hospitals, care homes, clinics, anywhere where any sort of infection is going to put the people at risk. And all of these are places where individuals, perhaps their immune systems may be compromised, they may be poorly, they may already be very susceptible to any sort of foreign infection, which will be carried by mice. The same goes with schools, children's homes, creches, susceptible individuals, where infection control is very important. But then anywhere where protection of public health is important would also be included in this area, where you can decide whether to use a lethal system or not. Labels can be quite restrictive, and the retailers can be quite restrictive. But as far as I can see, all the retailers will allow internal use of toxic bait or traps for monitoring and prevention in non-production areas where there is no open food, and those are basically the rules. Open food, you need to use a non-toxic system. A non-toxic doesn't have to be non-lethal. You could still use trapping boxes. You could certainly use an electronic monitoring system. That would be very quick, because once a mouse turns up into a food production area, you've got to do everything practically possible to kill it as quickly as possible. And that may involve toxic bait. It may even involve a glue board, if that is appropriate and safe at the time to do so, and can be regularly monitored. And yes, I've just covered that one. And there are preparations that can be used for permanent bait inside, but with the appropriate risk assessments and precautions. But I would recommend that you read the label very carefully. You will find that there's perhaps a little bit more license to use that under the control, and this is a phrase that is sometimes used, that it needs to be under the control of a competent person. This is why it's really important to get yourself qualified, and as most highly qualified as possible. Because the better qualified you are, the better able you are able to you can demonstrate you are a competent person. And therefore, being a competent person, you can make the judgment as to when or not to use toxic bait or glue boards or traps. If you feel less comfortable with this, or you feel unsure about this, then you are members of an association which has some excellent technical support, and the technical people at the BPCA will be very happy to help you and guide you through some of the minefields that are placed in our way when dealing with rodent infestation. So I'll leave you with this photograph of a nice piece of a nice bit of evidence of rodent infestation, and that, I believe, concludes my talk.
Fabulous, thank you, Mike. That's excellent. We always love I love it when people send me images of things like this as well. It's always interesting to see, isn't it? And what we're experiencing out there. Oh, you there, Mike? Oh, there we are.
Yes, yeah, I'm here. Yeah.
Good stuff. Okay, yeah, we've got 10 questions, and we've got a good 10 minutes for them. So hopefully we can get through them all. Some of them are quite long, so just give me a moment to read them out, and I'll pause when done. So, thanks for the tips on monitoring. If I do need to use glue boards, how can I best monitor these? Would motion sensor pads under the traps work? Are there other methods?
Oh, that's a good question. I think what you've got to do is think about what is the purpose of monitoring the glue boards on a frequent basis. Because there is some argument that glue boards should be monitored on an hourly basis. And the whole point of regular monitoring is because glue boards are, in essence, cruel. you've got a mouse stuck on it and it is suffering. And we don't want to leave this mouse suffering for any longer than absolutely necessary. So whatever system reduces that can only be helpful, whether that's video monitoring, whether it's having somebody go and walk past it once an hour, or whether it's you decide, okay, I'm going to do the absolute minimum, which I think is every 12 hours. It's really down to you to use your judgment. Read the guidelines, follow the guidelines. If what you are going to do can be argued as being better than the guidelines, then I think do it.
Absolutely. Great answer. Okay, so Dennis Anderson, now they have removed Neokill seed, which in North London was about the only bait that would be taken by mice. How are we going to go on in the industry if our products are being removed faster than they are being replaced?
Again, a really good question. And essentially, the point of my talk is that this is a consequence of us actually, well, there are two problems. One is the problem that is developed because of the resistance, either to the active ingredients or to the techniques that we're using, and sometimes even the formulations that we use. The resistance has really come because previous generations of pest controllers haven't done their job properly. They've allowed survivors, they've not followed up properly, they've not killed the entire population. The survivors have gone on to reproduce and produce more and more tolerant individuals. So today we suffer the consequences of what happened over the last 50 years. Now, to answer your question particularly, what you have to do is maybe you have to do taste tests and present a wide range of formulations and preparations and see which one is most acceptable. And then you've got to present it in a manner that the mouse will actually feel comfortable feeding. And I would say that actually, almost irrespective of the formulation, if you can ask yourself that question, this is why I went back to basics. Where are they now? And find where they're living and actually get the bait to where they're living, you will generally find that mice will eat less palatable food in the security of their harborages much more readily than come out and put themselves at risk in the open to eat something that's very much more tasty. And that's certainly my experience. So whatever bait you choose to use or is available to you, if you can find the harborages and get the bait into the harborages, you stand a very much better chance of actually overcoming any reluctance to eat bait or enter a bait box.
So I think as years go on or months go on, manufacturers will possibly, look at new formulations, different technologies, and that can help maybe as the future, comes upon us. Yes,
I think actually that what may end up happening is that the mice will make the decision for us, in that they will become so hard to kill that legislators will eventually have to actually bow to the pressure of the pest control industry and say, look, when we're saying, look, we need something either very much more toxic or we need more freedom in our ways of application and fewer restrictions, because otherwise you're just going to have to put up with the mice and the huge risks that are presented by uncontrollable mouse infestations.
Absolutely. Great. So we've got 12 questions now. I don't know if we get through them all, but we'll see how we go. So it's from John Harkins. Is there any further news on the legislation for field mice regarding escars? Due to the area I cover, it is the only species of mouse that I get, and I end up having to return daily to check the breakback traps. This is, of course, after all the methods, proofing and advice have been considered.
In answer to, I don't know. All my mouse control is all really around the industrial premises. So that's what I specialize in. So for me, field mice are a non-target animal, and any field mouse that gets into a factory, it's lost. I don't think I've ever come across an active wood or field mouse. When I say field mouse, we're talking about Apidemus. We're not talking about mus. Mus musculus is fair game. Mus musculus domesticus is even fairer game if you can kill it. epidemus. It's got to be proofing. This is where, if you've got to make daily visits, this is where you might want to consider an electronic mouse monitoring system, because whilst that may be more expensive initially, there's nothing more expensive than endless callbacks and follow-ups.
Mm. Absolutely, yeah, and then I see a lot of people are utilising that electronic monitoring as we go along. Great, thank you, Mike. So from Hugh Radford, bit of a long question here. So when we use anticoagulants as a chronic rodenticide to avoid bait shyness, as it works slower than acute rodenticides, therefore avoiding the association with how the mouse feels or what it has eaten, how do you think behavioural resistance has developed? Do they actually see and remember other mouse traps, etc., and then somehow pass that knowledge on to future generations?
I think it's actually simpler than that. Whilst mice are very social, and you may well get interactions with mice between mice in familial groups or in small colonies, what I think is probably much more likely to be happening is that we are selecting for particular types of behavior. What we're seeing here is evolution, red in tooth and a bait box avoidance. If you've got any sort of behavioral characteristic which creates some degree of advantage to the animal, in time that advantage will become magnified. And if that particular behavioral trait is, in fact, this box avoidance, I think, is much more akin to it's a hyperphobia, and this is a term I sort of created. It's like neophobia that rats have, but their familiarity with the object overcomes that. Whereas with the industrial mouse, as I believe actually it should be called now, the industrial mouse has developed this hyperphobic response to certain structures, and one of those structures is the bait box, because we've generally moved away from using bait trays, which we used to use in the 80s, which were quite useful but sometimes messy, and I can understand why they're less popular now. But if now we're being told we can only put bait in bait boxes, and the mice that show the greatest reluctance to go into a bait box are the ones that actually survive, we're doing nature's work for it by limiting how we kill our mice. And the ones that avoid it better survive. And survivors produce more. And all we do is reinforce that behavior. And that's how the behavioral resistance originated in the first place.
Mm. Excellent.
Does that answer the question?
I think it does. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. I can't see a better answer than that. And we're pretty much up for time, but I want to fit one more. So we've got some amazing questions here, and we've got 12 again. We've gone up to 12, so we're definitely not going to get them all done, but we'll certainly do one more. But if you're okay with it afterwards, Mike, I think my colleagues will be able to get these questions over to you in a written format, and then we can maybe get them out to the delegates, the panel.
Yep. Very happy to do that. Yes.
That'd be great. So let's do one more before we go for a sort of comfort break quickly. There's a relatively quick one here as an example from Nathan. Is a ground floor car park with flats above classified as indoors? The area is impossible to prove, so need to know if toxic bait on a permanent basis is okay.
Oh, that's a good question, but that's also a very hard question. Mm. I think what you've got to do is if it's a car park, you've got to look at the ERD. Okay, you can't exclude them. So what other elements of integrated pest management can you apply? And that's got to be good housekeeping. It may be that what you want to do is actually look at the areas immediately around the car park and say, okay, what have we got? Have we got high density plantings? Have we got waste bins? Can the waste bins be isolated in their own compound, which the compound is proofed? Limit the attractions around the car park if that's possible. If it's not possible, and the car park is an area where non-target animals could get into it, then you either have to you probably would have to go to a non-toxic but lethal system and use trapping boxes. And that's really what I would do in those circumstances, because that way you're not going to be having to follow up at high frequency. And if you do get a sudden influx of rodents and your traps aren't coping, then you've got a good case to say, right, we've got a rodent infestation. We need to be using a rodenticide here, but you do that on a short-term managed basis and review at 35 days. If it's all clear and done and dusted, remove the rodenticide.
Right. Yeah, tricky one as it was scenario based, but fabulous. Thank you, Mike, so much. We better go for a comfort break. So again, a virtual round of applause to you. I really appreciate, very informative, and everybody from their comments has really enjoyed the presentation. Thank you.